For most of his early life, the world answered him immediately. He pressed a key, and sound returned. He lifted his hands, and the room reacted. Music did not need to be imagined. It arrived, fully formed, through the ears, the body, the space around him. This was the environment in which Ludwig van Beethoven learned to trust himself. As a young man in Vienna, his confidence came not from reputation, but from response. People listened. They leaned forward when he played. They reacted before they thought. Music was not abstract yet. It was physical. It moved air. It moved people. He learned early that this immediate feedback mattered, not only for performance, but for certainty. When a phrase worked, he could hear it. When something failed, it revealed itself instantly. There was no delay between action and judgment. This made him fast, decisive, sometimes abrasive. He did not need patience. The world corrected him quickly enough. At this stage, his identity was simple. He was a musician because sound obeyed him. That obedience became a kind of contract. As long as he worked, the world responded. As long as he listened, music revealed itself. He built his confidence on this exchange, but contracts can fail without warning. The first changes did not announce themselves as danger. They arrived quietly. Almost politely, a faint ringing after long rehearsals, a dullness at the edges of certain tones, high notes that seemed to blur together instead of standing apart. None of this was alarming at first. Musicians experience fatigue. Everyone does. He told himself this was no different, temporary, a side effect of effort. He rested when he could. He adjusted lighting, posture, technique. He blamed the rooms, the instruments, the weather. Anything but himself. At this stage, nothing had collapsed. The system still functioned. He could still perform, still compose, still teach. And because everything still worked well enough, there was no reason to examine it too closely. This is how most failures begin, not with loss, but with denial made comfortable by routine. He continued to rely on what had always guided him, his ear, his instinct, the immediate return of sound. The problem was not that sound was disappearing. It was that certainty was. Some days were better than others. On good days, everything seemed normal. On bad days, the ringing lingered longer than expected. But inconsistency can be more dangerous than clarity. If something fails completely, it demands attention. If it fails partially, it invites excuses. So he learned to explain it away: long rehearsals, poor acoustics, uncooperative instruments. None of these explanations were false. They were simply incomplete. And because they sounded reasonable, they delayed the real question. What happens when the ear can no longer be trusted? At this point, that question remained unspoken. He still lived in a world that responded. Music still arrived. People still applauded. The feedback loop was weakened, but not broken. And as long as the loop existed at all, he believed it would repair itself. This belief shaped his behavior more than any medical advice could. He pushed harder, practiced longer, demanded more precision. If the sound seemed unclear, the solution, he thought, was effort. He had not yet learned that effort cannot repair a failing sense. Only redesign can, but redesign comes later. First, there must be recognition, and recognition requires something to stop working completely. That moment had not arrived yet, for now the world still answered him. Just slowly enough that he began to fear the silence between action and response. Not silence itself, but delay. That delay was the first sign that the system he depended on was beginning to drift out of alignment. He did not call it loss. He did not call it damage. He called it a problem that would pass. And because he believed that, he continued exactly as before. At first, the delay was subtle enough to excuse. A fraction of a second between movement and confirmation. A moment where certainty hesitated, then arrived late. For someone else, this might have gone unnoticed. For him, it did not. He had built his entire working life on immediacy. The distance between intention and result had always been short. Short enough to trust. Short enough to correct. Now that distance was stretching, not breaking, stretching. He began to notice it not in concerts, but in rehearsal, where there was no audience to distract him from the mechanics of sound. A chord that felt right, but did not arrive cleanly. A note that should have cut through the room, but instead dissolved into something vague and unreliable. He stopped, played it again, then again. Sometimes it returned, sometimes it did not. This inconsistency was worse than silence. Silence would have forced a conclusion. Inconsistency allowed hope. He started adjusting his behavior without admitting why. He stood closer to other musicians. He watched mouths more carefully. He positioned himself where sound should be strongest. None of this was discussed. None of it was explained. It was simply adaptation without acknowledgement. Publicly, he remained sharp, demanding, exacting. Privately, the work took longer. Pieces that once formed quickly now required revision, not because the ideas were weaker, but because confirmation took effort. He listened harder, and listening harder became exhausting. The ringing in his ears, once occasional, began to linger, not loud enough to panic, but persistent enough to intrude. At night, it followed him into silence. That was when doubt first appeared, not as fear, but as irritation. Why would sound misbehave now after years of obedience? He consulted doctors, accepted treatments, tried remedies that promised improvement without explanation. None of them offered clarity. What they could not give him was a simple answer. And without an answer, there could be no plan. So he continued as if the system still worked. This was the most dangerous phase. Because nothing had failed completely, he believed nothing was truly broken. But the signs were accumulating. Conversations became strained, not because he could not hear words, but because he could not rely on them. He missed the beginning of sentences. The ends arrived distorted. He guessed more than he listened. Sometimes he guessed correctly, often enough to avoid exposure. Sometimes he did not. Those moments stayed with him longer than the successful ones. He began to avoid situations where guessing would be required. Small gatherings replaced large ones. Written communication replaced speech. The world narrowed quietly. Still, he refused the obvious conclusion. Admitting the problem meant admitting its consequences, and those consequences were unthinkable. A composer who could not trust sound was a contradiction, so he chose another explanation. He blamed distraction, fatigue, overwork. He worked less publicly and more alone, telling himself this was temporary, even healthy. But alone, the problem followed him. Without other sounds to mask it, the ringing grew more apparent. He tested himself in small ways, dropping objects, tapping surfaces, listening for responses that no longer arrived with certainty. Each test ended the same way, unclear, inconclusive, just enough to disturb him. He did not record these moments. He did not speak of them. He simply carried them forward, adding them to a growing internal ledger of doubt. At some point he realized something had changed, not in his hearing, but in his behavior. He was no longer trusting sound automatically. He was evaluating it. Every note required confirmation. Every phrase demanded scrutiny. Music had slowed. What once flowed now required effort. This was not how it was supposed to work. The realization did not arrive as panic. It arrived as recognition. The system he depended on was no longer reliable enough to remain invisible. And once a system becomes visible, it can no longer be ignored. He did not yet know what this meant for his future. He did not yet imagine silence as permanent, but he understood this much. Something essential was no longer guaranteed. The delay between action and response was not an inconvenience. It was a warning, and although he continued to work, continued to compose, continued to perform when required, the ease was gone. In its place was effort. Effort applied to something that had once been effortless. That change marked the true beginning of collapse. Not because sound had vanished, but because trust had. Once the problem could no longer be ignored, he did what most people do first. He tried to continue, not by changing the work, but by changing himself. He adjusted his habits quietly, nothing dramatic, nothing that required explanation. He leaned closer when others spoke, positioned himself where sound should travel most clearly, watched faces with more attention than before. These were not strategies. They were reflexes. Each one brought him a little more certainty, just enough to delay a decision. At the piano, he developed new rituals. He pressed keys more firmly as if force might carry sound further. He played passages repeatedly, not to improve them, but to confirm that they still existed. Sometimes they did, sometimes they did not. When sound failed him, he turned to sensation, the vibration of the instrument, the resistance of the keys, the physical memory of motion. He told himself that music was more than hearing. That it lived in the hands as much as the ears. This was partially true, and partial truths can sustain a person longer than complete honesty ever could. Outside the music room, the cost of adaptation grew higher. Conversation required effort now. not because words were gone, but because they arrived distorted, missing edges, blurred into uncertainty. He learned to respond before being certain, to guess tone from context, to smile at the right moments. This kind of listening was exhausting. By the end of an evening, he felt as though he had been performing a role he had not rehearsed. Mistakes became unavoidable. He misunderstood instructions, answered questions incorrectly, responded to things that had not been said. Each error left a mark. Not publicly, he was careful about that, but internally the ledger grew heavier. He began to withdraw, not out of bitterness, but efficiency. Fewer conversations meant fewer calculations, fewer risks. This retreat was easy to justify. Work required focus. Solitude was productive. Noise was distracting. These explanations satisfied others, and more importantly, they satisfied him. But adaptation has a limit. The more he relied on workarounds, the more fragile they became. On good days, everything aligned. On bad days, nothing did. And because he could not predict which kind of day awaited him, every day began with uncertainty. He started writing things down. At first, this was practical. Notes, reminders, lists of tasks that had once lived comfortably in memory. Later, it became habitual. Written communication replaced speech wherever possible. Letters instead of conversations. Messages instead of meetings. Paper did not distort sound. Paper did not ring. But paper also did not respond. What he gained in clarity, he lost in immediacy. Music suffered in a different way, not in quality, but in speed. Ideas that once moved quickly now slowed under scrutiny. He could no longer trust his first impression. Every decision required confirmation, and confirmation was increasingly unreliable. So he revised, again and again. Entire passages were reworked, not because they were flawed, but because he could not be sure they were not. This was not creative refinement. It was defensive labor. And it consumed time. There were moments when he considered stopping, not permanently, but temporarily, a pause, a reset. But pauses require confidence that the system will resume. He no longer had that confidence. The more he adapted, the more obvious it became that adaptation alone was not enough. Workarounds could delay collapse, but they could not prevent it. He was spending more energy maintaining functionality than producing work. This imbalance could not last. Still, he continued, because continuing required no announcement. Stopping would. So he remained in motion, even as the ground beneath him shifted. This phase produced little that others would later celebrate. No grand breakthroughs, no defining works. It produced something else instead, awareness, an understanding slowly forming that the problem was not temporary and not external. It was structural. And structures, once compromised, cannot be repaired by effort alone. They require redesign. He did not know how to do that yet, but for the first time he began to suspect that continuing as before was no longer an option. Adaptation gave him time, but time came at a price. The more effort it took to continue, the less energy remained for the work itself. Days began to organize themselves around limitation, not openly, not deliberately, but inevitably. He chose quieter rooms, shorter conversations, familiar routes through the city. None of this felt like surrender. It felt like efficiency, but efficiency built on avoidance has a hidden cost. The world grew smaller. Invitations went unanswered, not refused, delayed. Delays turned into absence. People noticed but interpreted it differently. They saw temperament, not struggle, pride, not fear. He allowed these misunderstandings to stand. Correcting them would require explanation. Explanation would require admission. And admission would force a decision he was not ready to make. Music, meanwhile, demanded more from him than ever. He no longer trusted speed. What once came quickly now felt reckless. So he slowed everything down. Ideas were tested in isolation, separated from the context that once supported them. He examined phrases like mechanisms, checking each connection, each transition, each internal logic. This produced precision, but it also produced doubt. Without immediate feedback, every choice remained provisional. Nothing could be confirmed conclusively. This uncertainty followed him even when he stopped working. At night, when the city quieted and external sound faded, the ringing in his ears became unavoidable. It did not grow louder. It simply refused to leave. In those hours, he learned a new kind of listening. Not listening for sound, but listening to its absence. He tested silence, held his breath, moved his hands slowly, waited for responses that did not arrive. Each experiment ended the same way, inconclusive, unsettling. These moments did not produce panic. They produced calculation. If this was permanent, what could still be done? He did not answer that question yet. He was still measuring the damage. Doctors offered little guidance. Treatments promised improvement without guarantees. Opinions contradicted one another. What they could not offer was certainty, and without certainty, planning was impossible. So he remained suspended between options, too functional to stop, too compromised to continue comfortably. This state demanded constant vigilance. Every task required adjustment. Every interaction required preparation. He began to conserve energy, not consciously, but instinctively. Tasks that did not serve immediate purpose were postponed. Pleasure became secondary. Rest became strategic. This was not a creative life. It was a managed one. And management consumed attention. The more he managed, the less room remained for risk. Risk, once essential to his work, now felt dangerous. Improvisation declined. Spontaneity narrowed. The music did not fail, but it changed character. It became cautious. This frightened him more than silence ever could. Caution was not part of his identity. He had built his reputation on force, on decisiveness, on the willingness to push ideas beyond comfort. Now comfort was all he could afford. The realization arrived slowly but unmistakably. Adaptation was no longer preserving his work. It was reshaping it, and not in ways he recognized. He faced a dilemma he could no longer postpone. Continue adapting, and accept a smaller version of himself, or confront the problem directly and risk losing everything. This was not yet a moment of courage. It was a moment of accounting. What had adaptation achieved? Time, yes. Functionality, partially. But it had also produced isolation, fatigue, and a narrowing of possibility. The system was still operating, but only because he spent all his energy keeping it alive. This could not scale. It could not sustain years, let alone a lifetime. For the first time, he stopped asking how to continue. He began asking a different question. What would it mean to work if continuation itself were no longer the goal? This question did not offer comfort. It offered direction. Adaptation had reached its limit. The next step would require something else entirely. Not effort, not endurance, but change. There comes a point when continuing no longer feels like progress. For a long time, he had measured success by endurance, by how much strain he could absorb without breaking, by how long he could keep the system running through effort alone. But endurance has a hidden flaw. It assumes the system is worth preserving. The question he could no longer avoid was simple and deeply unsettling. What if the system itself was the problem? This was not a thought that arrived suddenly. It emerged slowly. After months of managing decline, he noticed it first in how he prepared to work. Once, preparation had been minimal. Sit down, play, adjust. Now, preparation took longer than the work itself. He arranged the room carefully, positioned the instrument precisely, removed distractions that no longer mattered, because distraction was no longer the threat. Uncertainty was. Each session began with negotiation. What could he rely on today? What would fail him without warning? This was not creativity. It was risk assessment. The realization was difficult to accept. He was spending more time preserving functionality than creating anything new. Adaptation had turned his work into maintenance. Maintenance keeps systems alive, but it does not allow them to grow. At some point he stopped and asked himself a question he had been avoiding. If hearing never returned, what kind of work would still be possible? This was not resignation, it was clarification. For the first time, he was no longer trying to restore what he had lost. He was trying to define what remained. The answer did not come quickly. At first, everything still pointed backward. Old habits, old instincts, old expectations. He continued to test ideas at the piano, even though the results were unreliable. He continued to seek confirmation through sound, even though sound could no longer be trusted. This produced frustration, not progress. Eventually, he recognized the pattern. Every time he tried to work as before, he reached the same limit. Not because the ideas were exhausted, but because the method was. This was the true break. Not the loss of hearing, but the loss of a workable process. Once he understood this, the problem changed shape. The question was no longer, how do I hear again? It became, how do I work without hearing? This shift did not feel liberating. It felt dangerous. Sound had always been the authority, the final judge, the thing that ended doubt. Removing it meant removing certainty itself. But certainty had already disappeared. What remained was choice. He began experimenting not with notes, but with approach. Instead of playing first and correcting later, he began writing before testing. Instead of trusting his fingers, he trusted relationships. How one idea led to another, how tension accumulated, how resolution was delayed. These were things he could analyze without immediate sound. At first, this felt artificial. Music had never been theoretical for him. It had been physical. But theory offered something sound no longer could: stability. A phrase could be justified by its function, not by how it pleased the ear in the moment. This was a profound change. He was no longer composing by reaction. He was composing by intention. The piano, once central, became secondary, a reference, not a judge. He no longer asked whether something sounded right. He asked whether it made sense. Did it belong where it was placed? Did it demand what followed? Did it fulfill its own logic? These questions were slower, but they were reliable. For the first time in a long while, he felt a different kind of control, not over sound, but over structure. This did not solve everything. There were days when doubt returned, when the absence of sound felt overwhelming. But something important had changed. Work was no longer about preservation. It was about construction. He was not trying to keep the old system alive. He was beginning to imagine a new one. This was not yet triumph, not yet success. It was the first step away from collapse, not forward, but sideways, away from what no longer worked, and toward something undefined but possible. Once he accepted that the old method was gone, he faced a more difficult problem. The absence of sound did not tell him what to do next. Removing a tool is not the same as replacing it. Knowing what no longer works does not automatically reveal what will. For a time he existed in this gap. He wrote cautiously, slowly, as if every decision needed permission it could no longer receive. The danger was clear. Without a reliable method, work could dissolve into hesitation. He needed a principle that did not depend on hearing. What he found was not new, but it had never been central before. Structure. He began to treat music less as sensation and more as sequence. Instead of asking how something sounded, he asked how it functioned. What role did this phrase play? What tension did it create? What expectation did it establish? These questions did not require immediate sound. They required coherence. He worked with relationships instead of impressions. How one idea leaned toward another. How contrast created clarity. How repetition transformed meaning. This was slower than his old way of working, but it was dependable. Dependability mattered more than speed now. He started drafting music that could be understood without being heard in the moment. Pages filled with notes that were not tested at the piano. Not because he avoided the instrument, but because he no longer trusted it as an authority. The piano became a reference point, not a verdict. When he did play, it was not to confirm beauty, but to check alignment. Was the balance intact? Did the weight feel right? If not, he returned to the page. This reversal was subtle, but decisive. Music no longer flowed outward from his hands. It was constructed inwardly, then released. At first, this felt unnatural. He doubted work that had not passed through sound immediately. He questioned whether music conceived this way could still be alive. But over time, something unexpected happened. The music grew more deliberate. Ideas unfolded with patience. Tension was sustained longer. Resolution arrived later and with greater force. Without the constraint of instant listening, he allowed structures to expand. He no longer worried whether a passage was comfortable. Comfort was no longer a useful metric. Instead, he asked whether it was necessary. This shift required discipline. Without sound to guide him, there was no immediate reward, only logic, only continuity, only the quiet assurance that one decision justified the next. Many drafts failed. Some collapsed under their own weight. Others revealed weaknesses only after extended work. But failure no longer felt like proof of incapacity. It felt like information. Each failed attempt clarified the method. He learned where complexity could be sustained and where it could not. He learned how much tension an idea could carry before it fractured. These were lessons sound alone had never taught him. Gradually, he began to trust the process, not because it was easy, but because it was consistent. Consistency replaced certainty. He was no longer seeking confirmation. He was building conviction. This changed his relationship to time. He no longer rushed toward completion. He allowed pieces to remain unfinished until their internal logic resolved itself. Music became less reactive, more intentional. Listeners would later describe this period as difficult, demanding, even harsh. He did not experience it that way. For him, it was clarity. The work finally matched his condition. It did not pretend to be effortless. It did not rely on immediacy. It accepted limitation and organized itself around it. This was not compensation. It was adaptation at a deeper level. Not adjustment, but redesign. He had not regained what he lost, but he had discovered something else. A way of working that did not collapse when sound withdrew. A method that could survive silence. This did not mean the struggle ended. Doubt remained. Fatigue remained. But the work no longer depended on pretending otherwise. For the first time since the decline began, his process was no longer fragile. It could bear weight. And that changed everything that followed. A method is only useful if it survives pressure. At first, the new way of working felt fragile. It functioned in isolation, on paper, in theory. But music does not exist in isolation. It moves through time. It accumulates weight. It demands continuity. He needed to know whether this redesigned process could endure more than a single idea. So he tested it, not deliberately, not as an experiment announced in advance, but by allowing the work to grow. He let pieces extend beyond comfortable length, beyond what could be easily checked or corrected. Instead of simplifying when uncertainty appeared, he leaned into it. He asked more of the structure. Could it sustain tension without immediate confirmation? Could it remain coherent when stretched? This was where the old method would have failed. Without sound to guide him moment by moment, there was no safety net. If the system collapsed, it would collapse completely. The early attempts were uneven. Some passages lost direction. Others accumulated density without purpose. But something important happened. He could identify why they failed. Not vaguely, not intuitively, but precisely. The problems were structural. A transition that arrived too early. A contrast introduced without preparation. A return that lacked justification. These were issues that could be corrected without hearing a single note. For the first time, failure did not feel personal. It felt mechanical, and mechanical problems can be solved. This realization changed his relationship to doubt. Before, doubt had paralyzed him. It had questioned his capacity, his identity, his future. Now doubt became diagnostic. If something did not work, it revealed where the structure was weak. He adjusted accordingly. The revisions were still slow, still demanding, but they were no longer blind. Gradually, the process stabilized. He noticed that once a piece reached a certain point, it no longer required constant checking. The logic carried itself forward. One decision made the next inevitable. This was new. Previously, inevitability had been produced by sound. Now it emerged from design. He trusted the system enough to stop intervening constantly. He allowed sections to remain unresolved while he worked elsewhere. He trusted that coherence would hold until he returned. This trust was not emotional. It was earned. The more the system endured, the more ambitious the work became. He allowed themes to reappear transformed. He delayed resolution beyond expectation. He built spans of tension that would have felt impossible before. Without immediate listening, he was no longer constrained by comfort. He wrote music that demanded attention, patience, and endurance. This was not a rejection of listeners. It was an acceptance of the work's internal demands. He no longer asked whether something would be easy to play. He asked whether it was necessary to write. This distinction mattered. The music stopped trying to persuade. It asserted itself. Over time, others began to notice the change. Not immediately, and not always positively. Some found the work difficult, dense, unforgiving. He did not correct them. Difficulty was no longer a flaw. It was a consequence. The system he had built did not optimize for ease. It optimized for integrity. There were still moments of frustration, days when fatigue made concentration impossible, nights when the absence of sound felt unbearable. But these moments no longer threatened the work itself. They were external to it. The process could pause and resume without collapsing. This was the difference. Before, any interruption risked failure. Now the system could hold even when he could not. This stability changed how he saw himself. He was no longer a composer desperately compensating for loss. He was a composer working under specific conditions, with methods suited to those conditions. This was not triumph, it was alignment. The work finally matched the reality. He did not regain what had been taken. He did not overcome it in the way stories prefer. Instead, he constructed something that did not depend on what he no longer had. By the end of this phase, the new system was no longer an experiment. It was habit, not because it was comfortable, but because it worked. The silence remained, but it no longer dictated the terms. The music could move forward without asking permission from sound. And in that quiet certainty, the foundation for everything that followed was firmly in place. The new system worked. But it worked at a cost. For the first time in his life, he was composing at a distance from the result. Music no longer returned to him immediately. It did not confirm itself through sound in the moment of creation. It waited, sometimes for days, sometimes longer. This delay changed the nature of judgment. Before, a mistake revealed itself quickly. Now, errors hid inside structure, emerging only after extended thought. This required a different kind of patience. He learned to live with uncertainty longer than he ever had before, to let ideas remain unresolved, to trust that coherence would appear later or not at all. This was difficult. There were moments when he missed the brutality of instant feedback, the clarity of knowing immediately whether something worked or failed. Now clarity arrived slowly, and sometimes it never arrived at all. He compensated by widening the distance even further. Instead of checking work constantly, he allowed it to age. He left pieces unfinished, returned to them later with fresh attention, evaluated them not by sound, but by necessity. Did this section still belong here? Did it justify its own existence? Did it demand to continue? If not, it was removed. This process was unforgiving. Not because it was harsh, but because it was indifferent. Ideas were not rejected because they were unpleasant. They were rejected because they were unnecessary. This indifference marked a shift in his relationship to his own work. He no longer protected ideas because they came easily. Ease had lost its authority. Only endurance mattered. As the distance between creation and confirmation grew, so did the scale of his thinking. He stopped composing in fragments, stopped thinking in moments. Music became something that unfolded across long spans of time. This required a level of planning he had never needed before. He thought in trajectories, in delayed resolutions, in returns that carried memory with them. Without sound to anchor him to the present, he worked in anticipation. Each decision was made with awareness of what would follow far later. This forward-looking approach changed everything. It allowed him to build tension slowly, to withhold resolution longer than expected. He no longer feared complexity. Complexity could be managed if it was structured correctly. What he feared now was incoherence. And incoherence could be detected without hearing a single note. He learned to recognize it on the page: misaligned proportions, unbalanced returns, transitions that arrived without preparation. These flaws revealed themselves through logic, not sensation. The more he relied on this method, the less he missed immediate sound. not because sound had become irrelevant, but because it was no longer necessary for decision-making. This realization was unsettling. Sound had once been central to his identity. Now it was optional. The implication was unavoidable. If sound was optional, then silence was survivable. This did not mean silence was comfortable. It remained intrusive, persistent, but it no longer defined his limits. He began to work longer stretches without touching the instrument. Entire sections were planned, revised, and finalized on paper. When he did return to the piano, it was with a specific purpose. Not to explore, not to discover, but to verify. And verification, unlike exploration, did not require full hearing. It required alignment. If the structure held, the details could be trusted. This approach produced work that felt different, even to him. It was less spontaneous, but more deliberate. Less conversational, but more forceful. The music no longer invited agreement. It demanded engagement. This was not arrogance. It was necessity. He could not afford to create work that depended on constant reassurance. The system required confidence, even when he felt none. So he built confidence into the structure itself. By the end of this phase, he was no longer reacting to loss. He was operating within a defined distance from it. The absence of sound had been acknowledged, accounted for, and integrated into the process. It no longer surprised him. It no longer dictated each decision. The work could move forward without constant negotiation. This did not make the work easier, but it made it possible, and possibility at this stage was enough. The distance he had learned to work within was no longer an adjustment. It became a condition. He stopped thinking of it as temporary, stopped expecting a return to anything earlier. This acceptance did not arrive as peace. It arrived as resignation sharpened into discipline. Every day now began with the same understanding. The work would not answer back. There would be no immediate confirmation, no reassurance carried on air. What existed instead was a set of rules he had built and learned to trust. Trust did not mean comfort. It meant predictability. He organized his time differently. Work was broken into segments that could survive interruption. Ideas were developed far enough that they did not collapse when left alone. This allowed him to step away without fear. Before, leaving a piece unfinished felt like abandoning it. Now it felt like letting it rest. Rest became part of the method. He returned to pages with a colder eye, less attachment, less urgency. What did not hold was removed, not with anger, but without hesitation. The distance had taught him something essential. Attachment was dangerous. Ideas that demanded protection were often the weakest, so he learned to let them fail quickly. This detachment did not make the work impersonal. It made it precise. Emotion no longer entered through impulse. It was shaped deliberately. He decided where tension would rise, where it would linger, where it would finally release. Nothing was accidental. This control did not come from arrogance. It came from necessity. Without immediate sound, chance was no longer a reliable collaborator. Everything had to be accounted for. He accepted this fully. The absence of sound changed how he imagined the listener. Before, the listener was present. A body in a room, a response waiting to happen. Now, the listener was abstract, a future presence, a mind encountering the work without explanation. This shifted his priorities. He no longer wrote to persuade in the moment. He wrote to withstand time. The work had to justify itself long after it left his hands. This demanded clarity at a deeper level. Not clarity of surface, but clarity of intention. He asked himself harder questions. Why must this passage exist? What does it contribute that nothing else can? What breaks if it is removed? If there was no answer, the passage was unnecessary. This ruthlessness was new. Earlier in his life, abundance had been a virtue. Now, necessity ruled. The music grew leaner in purpose. Even as it expanded in scale, he allowed sections to grow longer but not looser. Length had to earn itself. This balance was difficult. There were days when the weight of it all pressed heavily. The silence did not disappear. It never did. At times it felt louder than sound ever had, but it no longer disrupted the work. It existed alongside it. He stopped fighting it. Resistance required energy he could no longer waste. Acceptance freed that energy for something else. Focus. He focused not on what he could not hear, but on what the work required. This shift was subtle, but profound. The work was no longer something he forced into existence. It became something he served. Structure guided him. Logic constrained him. Necessity shaped every decision. Within those constraints, he found freedom. Not the freedom of impulse, but the freedom of coherence. He knew where he stood in the process at all times. There was no guessing. Progress was slow, but it was real. He could leave a piece for weeks and return, knowing exactly where to continue. This continuity was new. It did not depend on mood or sensation or inspiration. It depended on the system. The system held. By now, the distance between him and immediate sound was no longer felt as loss. It was simply space. Space in which thought could unfold without interruption. Space in which ideas could mature before being exposed. The work did not rush to meet the world. It waited. And when it finally emerged, it did so with a weight and certainty that had not been possible before. This was not a victory over silence. It was coexistence. The silence remained unchanged. But it no longer determined what was possible. The method did. There was a moment when he realized he was no longer guarding the work. For a long time, every piece had felt fragile. Something that might collapse if left unattended for too long. Something that required constant vigilance. Now, that anxiety was gone. Not because the work was easy, but because it no longer depended on him in the same way. The system carried weight on its own. He noticed it in how he approached new ideas. Before, every beginning felt risky. A wrong step could waste weeks. A flawed premise could poison an entire piece. Now, beginnings felt provisional. If an idea failed, it failed early. If it survived, it did so because it belonged. This reduced fear, not by removing uncertainty, but by containing it. Uncertainty no longer spread unchecked. It stayed where it originated. He stopped worrying about protecting the work from collapse. Instead, he let collapse reveal itself. This change altered his rhythm. He worked more steadily with fewer dramatic surges of effort. The work was no longer something he rushed toward. It was something he returned to, daily, methodically. This consistency mattered more than intensity. He could step away without dread. He could pause without losing direction. The process held. As a result, the music began to take on a different character, not in tone, but in confidence. Themes did not announce themselves. They emerged gradually through repetition, through variation. Nothing insisted on attention immediately. Attention was earned. He allowed ideas to remain understated longer than before. He trusted that their importance would become clear over time. This patience marked a departure from his earlier work. Previously, force had driven momentum. Now, inevitability did. The music no longer argued for itself. It assumed its place. This assumption was not arrogance. It was structural assurance. Each part knew its role. He noticed that revision had changed too. Earlier, revision had been defensive, a way of checking for hidden failure. Now, revision became refinement. He adjusted proportions, balanced density, clarified intention. He no longer revised out of fear. He revised out of precision. This shift freed energy. Energy that had once been spent maintaining functionality could now be directed toward expansion. The scope of the work grew, not recklessly, but deliberately. He began thinking in larger spans again. Movements stretched longer. Transitions became more demanding. Silences carried more weight. The system could handle it. It did not buckle under scale. This was new. Before, scale had magnified uncertainty. Now it revealed strength. He allowed complexity because complexity no longer overwhelmed the process. It was managed. Even when fatigue set in, the work did not dissolve. He could stop mid-thought and resume later without losing coherence. This continuity changed how he related to time. Work was no longer measured in bursts. It unfolded across weeks and months. This slow unfolding suited his condition. He no longer needed immediacy. He needed reliability. And reliability had been achieved. There were still difficult days. Days when concentration faltered. Days when silence felt oppressive. But these no longer threatened the work itself. They affected pace, not direction. This distinction was critical. Direction was secure. For the first time since the decline began, he felt ahead of the work rather than behind it. Not in terms of completion, but in understanding. He knew where pieces were going long before they arrived. This foresight reduced anxiety. The work no longer surprised him in destructive ways. Surprises, when they came, were productive. They revealed possibilities, not failures. This was the clearest sign that the rebuilding phase was nearing completion. The process no longer required constant correction. It functioned as intended. What remained was to see what this system could produce when pushed to its limits. He was no longer asking whether the method would hold. He was beginning to ask how far it could go. The work did not need protection anymore. It could stand. And because it could stand, he was finally free to let it grow. When the system stopped requiring protection, it began to reveal something else. Output. Not in bursts, not as sudden revelation. But as accumulation, work began to appear more regularly, not because he forced it, but because nothing obstructed it anymore. Ideas no longer stalled at the beginning. They moved forward until they encountered genuine resistance. This distinction mattered. Resistance was no longer internal, it was structural. If a piece stopped progressing, the reason was visible. A relationship that lacked purpose. A transition that arrived too soon. A return that carried no memory. These were solvable problems. He no longer confused difficulty with failure. Difficulty had become the natural state of the work. Failure, by contrast, was specific. This clarity allowed momentum. Pieces that would once have consumed months now unfolded with steady inevitability. Not faster, but cleaner. The work no longer doubled back on itself unnecessarily. Each revision narrowed focus. Each pass reduced ambiguity. The system did what it was designed to do. He noticed that certain musical decisions began repeating across different works, not as habits, but as solutions, ways of delaying resolution, methods of layering tension, techniques for sustaining coherence across long spans. These were not stylistic choices. They were functional. He did not ask whether they were beautiful. He asked whether they worked, and because they worked, they stayed. This produced a recognizable character in the music. Listeners would later identify it as bold, uncompromising, even confrontational. From within the process, it felt inevitable. The music was no longer shaped by taste. It was shaped by necessity. He was not expressing defiance. He was expressing constraint. What emerged from this constraint was something larger than intention. The pieces did not explain themselves. They assumed endurance. They demanded attention over extended time. This demand was not aggressive. It was patient. It waited for the listener to meet it. He no longer worried about immediate reception. Approval had lost relevance. The work was complete when its internal demands were satisfied. Nothing else mattered. This attitude changed his relationship to completion. Before, finishing a piece had felt like release, a letting go. Now, completion felt like closure. Not relief, but alignment. The work ended when nothing more was required. This precision carried consequences. He no longer produced incidental music. Nothing was casual. Every piece carried weight. Even smaller works were dense with intention. There was no room for excess. This concentration was exhausting at times. The system demanded attention even when fatigue set in, but it also offered something in return: predictability. He knew what the work required from him, and he knew what it would not tolerate. This reduced waste. Energy spent on anxiety, on second-guessing, on regret, was reclaimed. That energy flowed back into construction. He found himself capable of sustaining long arcs of work without collapse. This endurance was new, not physical but structural. The process could support prolonged effort without degradation. This allowed him to think beyond individual pieces. He began to imagine trajectories across multiple works, how one idea might evolve over years, how tensions introduced now might resolve much later. This long view would have been impossible earlier. It required stability. The system provided it. There were moments when he recognized the significance of this change, not emotionally but intellectually. He understood that the conditions under which he worked had permanently altered his output. This was not a phase. It was a new mode. The work no longer reflected struggle directly. It reflected adaptation. The absence that had once threatened everything now functioned as a boundary. Within that boundary, the work was free from reliance on sensation, free from immediate validation, free from the need to persuade. It did not ask for permission. It existed. By the end of this phase, the rebuilding was complete, not because the struggle had ended, but because it had been fully integrated. What remained was not compensation, it was capability. The method no longer belonged to a crisis. It belonged to him. And with it, he was prepared to face whatever silence remained without hesitation. The system could carry him forward. By the time the rebuilding was complete, there was no longer a sense of crossing a finish line. Nothing had ended. What had changed was simpler and deeper. He had stopped waiting for improvement. The condition that once defined every decision was no longer something he measured daily. It was simply there, present, unchanging. And because it no longer promised relief, it no longer demanded constant attention. This did not mean resignation. It meant orientation. His life adjusted around what could not be altered. He no longer structured his days around the hope that hearing might return. He structured them around the certainty that it would not. This certainty was not cruel. It was stabilizing. Hope had required energy. Expectation had consumed focus. Now both were unnecessary. What remained was work, not as escape, not as distraction, but as function. The work did not exist to compensate for loss. It existed because it could. This distinction mattered. He no longer defined himself by what had been taken. He defined himself by what continued to operate. The method he had built was no longer a response to crisis. It had become habit. The days followed a rhythm that no longer fluctuated with emotion. He worked when the structure called for it. He rested when attention declined. Neither state required justification. This balance had been impossible before. Earlier, every pause felt dangerous. Every rest felt like retreat. Now, pauses were part of continuity. Nothing collapsed if he stepped away. The work waited. He noticed a change in how others perceived him. Not admiration, not sympathy. Something quieter, reliability. He was no longer unpredictable, no longer volatile. The work arrived when it was ready, not sooner, not later. This consistency was new. It did not come from health. It came from alignment. The process fit the condition. Because of this fit, there was no longer friction at the center of his life. The silence remained. It always would, but it no longer pressed inward. It existed alongside thought, alongside effort, alongside intention. It was not fought, it was accommodated. This accommodation extended beyond music. He spoke less, but more deliberately. He chose environments carefully. Noise was avoided not out of fear, but out of irrelevance. It had nothing to offer him. What mattered now was clarity, clarity of structure, clarity of direction, clarity of purpose. These were not affected by sound. He was no longer concerned with how the world responded in the moment. Applause, confusion, resistance, all arrived too late to matter. They did not alter the work. The work had already completed its internal journey. This detachment was often misunderstood. Some saw withdrawal. Others saw defiance. Neither was accurate. He had simply stopped negotiating. The terms were set. Within those terms, everything functioned. This did not make life easier. It made it workable. Fatigue still came. Frustration still surfaced. But these no longer threatened identity. They were conditions, not verdicts. The difference was profound. Earlier, every difficulty asked a question. Now, difficulties were answered in advance. The system accounted for them. This allowed a quiet confidence to take hold, not confidence in outcome, but confidence in process. Whatever emerged from the work would be coherent. Whatever failed would fail for reasons that could be understood. There were no longer invisible dangers, no sudden collapses. This predictability was the true transformation. He had not defeated the silence. He had not transcended it in any heroic sense. He had learned to live inside it without distortion. The silence no longer altered his decisions. It no longer dictated his limits. It was a constant, and constants can be designed around. By the time this realization settled fully, there was nothing left to prove, no redemption to perform, no recovery to demonstrate. There was only continuation, not as struggle, but as state. And in that state, he no longer measured his life against what it had once been. He measured it against what it could now sustain. The answer was clear. It could sustain everything that mattered. When everything finally settled, there was no moment of recognition, no sudden understanding, no sense of arrival. Life did not announce that it had entered a new phase. It simply continued. What changed was not what he did, but how little resistance remained between intention and action. The method held. The condition remained. And because both were stable, there was nothing left to negotiate. He no longer thought in terms of loss. Loss implies comparison, a measuring against something that once existed. Comparison had become irrelevant. The past no longer served as a reference. What mattered was what the present could support, and the present now was functional. This functionality did not bring joy in the way triumph does. It brought something quieter, assurance. The work no longer required courage. It required attention. courage had been necessary during collapse. During rebuilding, now it was excess. Excess energy could be redirected. He used it to refine rather than to resist. The music that emerged during this period did not sound like compensation. It did not announce suffering, nor did it seek sympathy. It carried weight without explanation. Listeners encountered it as something complete, self-contained, indifferent to biography. This indifference was its strength. The work did not point back to struggle. It pointed forward to continuity. He did not think of himself as transformed. Transformation implies departure from what came before. He experienced something closer to alignment. Everything in his life now operated within the same set of constraints. There were no contradictions left to manage. What he could do and what he did were no longer in conflict. This reduced friction at every level. Decisions became simpler, not easier, simpler. They were guided by necessity, not aspiration. He did not ask what might be possible if conditions were different. He asked what was required given the conditions as they were. This question had clear answers. The clarity it produced extended beyond work. His days became predictable in their structure, but not monotonous. Routine did not dull attention. It focused it. He noticed details he had once overlooked, the pacing of his own energy, the limits of concentration, the moments when rest preserved more than effort ever could. These observations informed everything. Nothing was wasted. There was no longer a need to prove anything, not to audiences, not to history, not to himself. The work justified itself through coherence. That was enough. When fatigue arrived, it did not feel like failure. It felt like information. When silence pressed in, it did not feel hostile. It felt neutral. He had learned that neutrality could be lived with. He had learned that not every condition needed to be overcome. Some needed to be inhabited fully until they lost their power to distort. This was the final shift. Silence had once demanded attention. Now it did not. It was present, but it did not intrude. The mind moved around it without effort. The work moved through it without delay. This state did not promise happiness. It promised sustainability, the ability to continue without eroding oneself in the process. This was not a lesser outcome. It was a precise one. By the end of his life, nothing about his condition had improved. Nothing about it had softened. But nothing about it needed to be explained anymore. The work existed. It stood on its own. It did not testify to suffering. It did not offer resolution. It demonstrated something quieter. That a human life does not need to be restored in order to function. It needs to be organized around what is real. He had done that, not dramatically, not heroically, methodically, and because of that, what remained was not a story of loss or victory. It was a record of continuity, a life that continued to operate without distortion, a body of work that did not ask to be understood through the lens of limitation. It simply existed. That existence was the final achievement. not because it overcame anything, but because it endured without needing to pretend otherwise.